Good evening, everyone. Thanks for your patience as we took a couple of minutes to make sure everything was set. It's always a great day when it's our first day back for the academic season, but we also usually have to dust off a couple cobwebs as we get back into the routine. So thank you all for being here tonight. My name is Megan Radecki. I have the privilege to serve as the director here at the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies, and we want to give you all a warm welcome for our inaugural event this 24-25 season here on Constitution Day. So thank you for being here. I recognize some students, some CLA fellows that we have here, some Hauenstein Center members, professors, faculty, staff, and friends of the Hauenstein Center. So thank you so much for joining us today. I want to share, if some of you recall, and I won't ask who remembers because I did this once before and not very many people raised their hands. So our theme for last year, we introduced a theme to help knit together our programming. So our theme last year was empowered citizenship, and it's an idea that we wove through all of our programming for the year. Well, this year I'm very excited to announce that our new theme, if you've not heard it yet, is E Pluribus Unum, or out of many one. So as we think about as we think about an election year especially, and the different programs that we're going to bring for you to consider and to listen to, an overarching theme and idea, maybe even goal that we will be discussing is the concept of E Pluribus Unum, and what that means for us today. Certainly a couple hundred years ago, we thought about it differently with 13 colonies coming together. Our world and our nation looks much different. So again, as we journey together this season, you will hear us reference the theme quite often, but that again is E Pluribus Unum and thinking about what that means for us today. Certainly we are here to celebrate Constitution Day. We can all wish a happy 237th birthday to the Constitution. I won't make us sing because that would be awkward. But you may or may not know that as an entity that receives federal funding, we are actually mandated to hold Constitution Day educational programming. So the Hauenstein Center is pleased to do that on behalf of the university. So thank you for joining that. And I think that it's especially salient that we talk about the Constitution as we think about this current election year. You hear about it talked about in the media and on both sides and from our various officials who are running for office and whatnot. So it's high time that we revisit that. If you yourself need to brush up, I would encourage you to grab a pocket Constitution because we have them right out on the table. So grab one of those on your way out. It may sound a little silly, but if you haven't read it in a while, and I think after we hear Dr. Hemmer's talk, you will probably feel compelled to go back and visit those words, and who knows, maybe even commit them to memory. So again, we want to thank you. It's going to be a great season. We're glad you're all here, and as is our tradition, I want to go ahead and introduce one of our Cook Leadership Academy fellow candidates. Many of you know that the Cook Leadership Academy is one of the Hauenstein Center's pride and joys. It's where we have the opportunity to, in the legacy of Ralph Hauenstein, help cultivate ethical, effective leaders for the 21st century. We have 74 brilliant students who are journeying with us through the lens of leadership this year, and we have one tonight who's going to share a little bit about her own journey. So with that, let me tell you about Nancy Hogewerf. Nancy Hogewerf is a fourth-year undergraduate student studying political science and international relations. This is her second year as a fellow candidate. She's very active on campus, serving as the chair of the allocations committee for GVSU Student Senate and also as a research assistant for the political science department. She's also putting her studies to work in electoral politics, having interned on Capitol Hill last summer and currently working on a campaign for Michigan's 3rd Congressional District. And poor Nancy, taking a full load of classes, doing her extracurriculars, and I'm pretty sure she told me she had 2 15-hour campaign days these last 2 days. So round of applause for her for being very engaged and making it happen, as many of our students are. They're just incredible. Nancy's passionate about social justice, public policy, and politics, and she's very excited about her upcoming year and being a part of the Cook Leadership Academy. And with that, help me again to welcome Nancy Hogewerf.
Hello, everyone. As Megan mentioned, e pluribus unum, or out of many, one, a phrase which decorates the United States Great Seal and is plastered on every coin, dollar, military uniform, and passport in the country. So surely it has to be important, right? Well, the motto alludes to a rather delicate time period in America, the unification of the 13 colonies. At a time when any of the 13 colonies could have become their own nation, they decided that they would be stronger together. So, out of the 13 separate colonies, a single new entity had emerged, a nation. Thus, out of many, there was one. Now, e pluribus unum is a steadfast reminder to the humble beginnings of this country. But for me, the motto means so much more. For those who don't know me, I'm Nancy. I've been drawn to politics since I was in middle school, which I'm aware isn't the most common interest for a teenager. But growing up, I realized that the prevailing political ideology in my hometown was not one that I agreed with. So, as disengaging as that was, I have since been committed to creating community through shared passion and politics, so no one has to feel the disengagement that I felt. Now, my interest in politics and government has led to me to be involved in many things, like Grand Valley Student Senate, Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy, and local electoral politics, and even interning on Capitol Hill. But out of all of these things, I'm most proud of the rallies I've organized here in West Michigan. More specifically, I'm proud of the rally I organized in the aftermath of the shooting at MSU. I had two goals for this rally. The first was to make a call for action to enact laws that would prevent a similar tragedy from ever happening again. The second was to create a supported and empowered community in spite of the tragedy. I will not lie, taking on the task of organizing this rally, spreading the word, inviting students, coordinating with local elected officials was a lot of work, especially when I was hurting too. But I knew the rally had to be done because our community then, more than ever, deserved something to bring us together. But the rally's purpose was validated when I approached a student following the rally. And through her tears, she explained how she was a student at MSU and how she was on campus during the shooting just nights before. She thanked me for bringing local elected officials to the rally because she had the opportunity to speak with one. And, in her words, it was the first time she'd ever felt truly heard. The same representative who talked with the student at my rally went on to vote in support of historic gun reform legislation that was signed into law by Governor Gretchen Whitmer just weeks later. So for those here tonight, I ask you to think of the endless possibilities that exist and choose one that you believe in wholeheartedly to make a reality. Because e pluribus unum, out of many, there is one that just might change history. My name is Nancy Hogworth, and I am a leader. Thank you. Now it is my pleasure to introduce to the stage Dr. Nicole Hemmer. Dr. Hemmer is an associate professor of history and the director of the Carolyn T. and Robert M. Rogers Center for American Presidency at Vanderbilt University. A historian specializing in media, conservatism, and the presidency, she is the author of 2 books and a frequent commentator for outlets like the New York Times, Vox, the Washington Post, and CNN. Please welcome Dr. Nicole Hemmer.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Nancy and Megan, for that introduction. I'm going to continue the theme of e pluribus unum as we begin to talk about the Constitution and democracy, or I think more accurately, the Constitution versus democracy, and what that means for all of us going forward. In the mid-18th century, an artist named Pierre-Eugène de Cimetière immigrated from the Republic of Geneva, eventually settling in the American colonies. After the Revolution, he contributed much to the new life of the nation. He painted the first known portrait of George Washington, which later appeared on the 1-cent coin. He designed the Great Seal of the United States. And he was the first to suggest a new motto for the country. It was 13 letters long, a nod to the 13 colonies becoming one nation, e pluribus unum, out of many, one. As it happened, it was easier to declare the many to be one than to actually unite them. The first effort to govern the new states, the Articles of the Confederacy, vested too little power in the federal government. The experiment failed after just a few years. In 1789, the states ratified a new constitution, and it has lasted with some alterations for more than 230 years. The governing structures of the Constitution have largely remained in place, even as the country has grown and changed. Modifications have been made to how we choose vice presidents and senators. The franchise has been expanded first to Black men, then to women, and then to everyone over the age of 18. But the basic structure, designed to solve the problem of making the many states into one nation, has remained. And that is a problem. It is a problem because over those 235 years, the central challenge of governance has changed. It is no longer about keeping states united. It is about securing and sustaining a multiracial democracy. While the Constitution has shifted to accommodate that change, most notably in the expansion of the franchise, it has not really caught up to altered expectations. And make no mistake, there has been a profound shift in how the public understands representative democracy as a form of government, one reflected in a changed understanding of e pluribus unum. Over the last several decades, when scholars, politicians, and journalists have invoked the national motto, they have not been pondering federalism. They haven't been referring to large states versus small states, or red states versus blue states. They certainly haven't been referencing the core tension in the initial Constitution between slave states and free states. In fact, they haven't been thinking about states at all. They have been instead referring to the integration of diverse peoples into one body politic. There are endless examples of this, books about the integration of immigrants into the United States, essays about diversity and democracy. Robert Putnam, a sociologist best known for his book Bowling Alone, delivered a lecture in 2006 that neatly captured the transformation in our understanding of the national motto. It was called E Pluribus Unum, Diversity and Community in the 21st Century. He summed up his argument this way: the task of becoming comfortable with diversity will not be easy or quick, but it will be speeded by our collective efforts, and in the end, well worth the effort. One great achievement of human civilization is our ability to redraw more inclusive lines of social identity. The motto on the Great Seal of the United States, E Pluribus Unum, reflects precisely that objective, namely to create a novel one out of a diverse many. Now, that might not have been Pierre de Saint-Martyr's objective, but today, the idea of redrawing more inclusive lines of social identity has become what most people mean when invoking the idea of out of many, one. And just like our understanding of the national motto has changed, our understanding of representative democracy has also changed between the founding era and today. The founders were familiar with worlds where people of many races and religions and languages and ethnicities mingled, but they never met on equal ground. As we know, and as many of the founders acknowledged, their ideas of equality were far more rhetorical than real. They did not conceive of a multiracial democracy with near universal voting rights. And that's probably why the US didn't become such a democracy until nearly 200 years after the revolution. But in the 1960s, the US did become such a democracy. The old idea of a republic in which the electorate was sharply circumscribed and the popular vote was deemed too risky for most elections, that fell away, that disappears in the 20th century. And it is replaced with a shared democratic aspiration, universal voting rights that allow popular will to be translated into policy with ironclad protections from discriminatory laws. The problem is, the Constitution never allowed for such a democracy. And the gap between the government that the Constitution created and what the people have grown to expect has become a chasm. And as a result, our institutions are straining to the breaking point. The shift in what democracy means is the subject of my talk this evening. I chose to focus on this topic on Constitution Day because it goes right to the heart of the legitimacy of our government. If a significant portion of Americans expect a well-functioning democracy to look a particular way, if they expect a just system to have certain features, and then they discover time after time that it doesn't, their faith in our democratic system will erode. Now, shaken faith can lead to reform. It has in the past. But it could just as easily lead to disengagement, distrust, and nihilism. And I trust that most of us here have had enough of disengagement, distrust, and nihilism over recent years. So my goal tonight is to show how Americans' understanding of democracy has changed, how they have sought to reform and work around constitutional limits, and how we might think about the future of reform and democratic legitimacy in this especially precarious moment. And I want to start by talking about voting. Most of us today understand voting as the cornerstone of democratic government. It's not the totality of it, but it is the most fundamental right. And so I think people are often surprised to learn or to remember that voting rights aren't mentioned in the original Constitution or in the Bill of Rights. It wasn't something that the founders felt the need to articulate. And while we may recall that the founders were skeptical of too much democracy, I think I and most of us seldom remember how little direct voting the original Constitution allowed. In its original form, the Constitution created a federal government in which only representatives to the House were elected by popular vote. State legislatures voted for senators. The Electoral College selected the president. The Declaration of Independence may have asserted that governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed, but that consent was, for most of the governed, not granted through the ballot box. In the early years of the Republic, only about 20 to 25% of Americans could vote. States, rather than the federal government, set the rules for the electorate, and nearly all of the first states placed property requirements for voting. They actually didn't all institute limits for race or sex. Black men with property could vote in several states. In New Jersey, women with property could vote. But you had to have property. And then came what was known as the Age of Democracy, when property barriers fell and race and sex barriers were raised. Universal white male voting, what is often referred to as universal manhood suffrage, became the order of the day. And while now we look back at this period and we see it as an era of a sharply constricted electorate, at the time, it was viewed by most people as a moment of a wild democratic awakening. It was for this reason Alexis de Tocqueville, sensing the rise of democracy in his home country of France, traveled to the United States in the 1830s. As he wrote in his travelogue, Democracy in America, I confess that in America, I saw more than America. I sought there the image of democracy itself, with its inclinations, its characters, its prejudices, its passions, in order to learn what to fear or to hope from its progress. To fear or to hope. For Americans, these were both common reactions to burgeoning democracy. Was this new age of democracy the realization of the promise of the founding, or the devolution of the republic into rank mob rule? Honestly, opinions were split, and the move toward universal white male suffrage itself met stiff resistance in some parts of the country. In Rhode Island, for instance, the state allowed only for landowners to vote. And that meant by the 1840s, about 60% of the men in Rhode Island were excluded from the electorate. And that to them felt to be an intolerable situation. Reformers, led by Thomas Dorr, wrote a new constitution. They called it the People's Constitution, which would enfranchise all white, native-born men in the state. And they put it up for a vote, And in a state government that was peopled entirely by property owners, it was repeatedly defeated. So Dorr and his supporters ultimately took up arms against the state in 1842. This was called Dorr's Rebellion, and as far as rebellions go, it was not particularly tumultuous. It was short-lived. It resulted in no casualties. But the fervor that led to that revolt convinced Rhode Island's elite that Dorr's vision of democracy could not be forestalled forever. A year later, in 1843, Rhode Island instituted universal voting for native-born white men. Now, whether you were a critic of this expanded franchise or a fierce advocate, as Dorr was, the debate over this new age of democracy was not a debate about a change in the relationship between the states and the federal government, but between the individual and the ballot box. It was broad rule by individuals that was so celebrated in the age of democracy. And that logic, that thriving democracy meant more people eligible to vote, would become the logic of democratic governance in the decades that followed. 3 constitutional amendments would widen the franchise. The 15th Amendment in 1870, which allowed Black men to vote. The 19th Amendment in 1920, which enabled women to vote. And the 26th Amendment in 1971, which lowered the age of voting to 18. And importantly, in each case, the Constitution was amended to override state law. The original Constitution was silent on the question of the electorate. Today's Constitution has quite a bit to say about it. And importantly, these amendments did not just elevate federal power over state power. It wasn't just the big bad Constitution coming and striking down state law, but it was elevating individual rights over states' rights. There was something about the individual's right to vote that people had come to believe made democracy better. As the idea of popular democracy, represented by the rights of individual voters, grew in the United States, it ran headlong into the Constitution. And that's not just in the case of the franchise where the Constitution was amended, but actually just in terms of the popular vote in general. Because the original Constitution was at best suspicious of, and at worst hostile to, popular democracy. The architects of the Constitution were careful to create mechanisms that diluted the power of individual votes, building firewalls like the Electoral College and the Senate as safeguards against too much democracy. But by the late 19th century, a time when voter turnout was hitting 80% in federal elections, imagine voter turnout hitting 80%, where people were going to the polls in enormous numbers. These barriers to popular democracy were approaching a crisis point. And that is because of a much bigger political problem in the United States. The economy in the United States was not working for most Americans. A movement began to form among workers and farmers who felt that the economic policies of the country were failing them, and in many ways, they were right. 11 out of 12 million families in the United States were living in poverty. Wealth disparities were enormous. Regular recessions left workers unemployed for long stretches. A lack of wage and workplace safety laws meant people worked dangerous jobs for low pay with no protections. And when people lobbied, when they formed a movement and they pressured their state governments to pass new laws to protect them, a conservative Supreme Court struck them down. So farmers and workers organized what became known as the populist movement. They advocated for particular economic and labor policies, but they also understood that the real problem was a political system that had become unresponsive to popular will. In particular, they argued that corporations had grown much more powerful than the government, and that government officials were not just more solicitous to corporations, but had been bought off by them. And indeed, there were a series of scandals in the late 19th and early 20th century that showed that federal politicians, particularly senators, were corrupted by corporations. This is one of the famous political cartoons of the era, where all of the senators are sitting in the front row, and the bosses of the Senate, the Copper Trust, the Steel Beam Trust, the Iron Trust, the Sugar Trust, those are all the ones who are actually running the Senate. And this was a point of view that a lot of Americans had, that it was very, very rich people and rich corporations who were actually running the government. And so something had to change. Something more than policy had to change. The structure of democracy itself had to change. So a subset of people were able to vote for state legislatures at this time. State legislators then picked members of the Senate. Senators confirmed Supreme Court justices. And what people took from this is that there was too little direct democracy, that the power of the voters was too diluted. So by the time you got to the Senate or the Supreme Court, there was no way for the popular will to enter into the conversation. And as you can imagine, this didn't sit well with many voters. Pressure mounted to institute a series of workarounds to allow for more democracy. And some of this took place at the state level, where states allowed for referenda and initiative processes that would allow voters to put forward legislation that had been ignored by their representatives. So we're now very familiar with this idea of ballot initiatives on issues like abortion rights and marijuana legalization and property taxes. And because we're so familiar with the idea of initiatives, it's easy to forget how radical of a move this actually was. Legislative bodies, populated by elected officials, were supposed to set the agenda, deliberate over proposed bills, pass new laws. What initiatives did was they put that power in the hands of the people, allowing them to sidestep the legislature altogether and create a radically more democratic process. And an even more radical change awaited. In 1913, popular discontent had grown so intense that the Senate passed and the states ratified a new amendment that required direct election of senators, slashing the power of state legislatures and reinforcing the notion that election by popular vote was more democratic and more legitimate than the diluted representation outlined by the Constitution. And I want to sit for a moment with both of these reforms, the rise of initiatives and the turn to the popular vote in the Senate. Now, in the case of the Senate, you have a constitutional amendment, the cleanest way to reform the government and to bring the Constitution in line with expectations of democracy. Of course, passing a constitutional amendment is pretty difficult work. It requires 2/3 of the vote of both the House and the Senate, and then ratification by 3/4 of the states. The 17th Amendment, which required the direct election of senators, is probably one of, if not the most impressive addition to the Constitution. And that is because it required senators, 2/3 of the Senate, to vote against their own power base. Right? They had been put into office, most of them, by state legislatures. And so now they had to say, okay, not state legislatures anymore, now it's going to be the people themselves. So they voted against their own power base, and in some cases, their own interest. And under intense public pressure, 64 of the then 92 senators voted to give up the way that they were traditionally elected. This other set of reforms, the rise of the initiatives, introduced new tools to make legislation more bottom-up and more democratic by working around legislators. These tools were not about making it easier or more expansive to vote for representatives, but rather to sidestep representatives altogether. And that idea, going around the problem, going around the legislators, going around the Constitution, is one that would gain popularity throughout the 20th century. Going around things was also something that President Franklin Roosevelt, when he became president in 1933, also had to deal with. He puzzled over the problem of democracy and the Constitution. As president, he would invoke the idea of democracy more times than any other president in the 20th century. In fact, he used the word more times in his inaugural address than any other president in history until Joe Biden became president. Roosevelt came into office with huge electoral majorities. He had supermajorities in the House and in the Senate. This complete control of the executive and legislative branches laid bare a check on popular legislation that endlessly frustrated the new president, the Supreme Court. The 9 justices who served as the sole interpreters of the Constitution confirmed in Roosevelt and others' minds that the Constitution was indeed an undemocratic document that protected the powerful. Legislation that sailed through Congress died again and again in the marble halls of the Supreme Court. Roosevelt very famously developed a plan to work around the court, what we now know as the Court Packing Plan of 1937. It has come up a lot in recent years. Ultimately, it didn't work. And Southern Democrats within Roosevelt's own party relied on the court to keep the Jim Crow regime intact, and so they weren't very interested in switching things up. But even just threatening to change the court, to pack the court, led to a couple of changes. One, it chastened the justices on the court, who began to allow some of Roosevelt's legislation to stand. And 2, it created a potential model for a constitutional workaround that future presidents, none more so than Joe Biden, would consider when they considered the court. That no, you weren't going to abolish the court, you weren't going to take away all of its power, but maybe there was a way to work around the court and make it line up more with popular democracy. The reason why the Supreme Court has become such an object of consternation and a desire for change is that for nearly all of American history, the Supreme Court has been a deeply conservative institution. I could give a whole other talk on the role that the Supreme Court has played in American politics. That's a talk for another day. But there is one period in which the Supreme Court changed, in which it took a much more flexible view and a more expansive interpretation of the Constitution, and that was in a period that stretched from around 1954 to 1973. And that period, the Warren Court, coincided, not coincidentally, coincided with the turn toward multiracial popular democracy in the United States. And that is because of what happened in the 1960s. That was the decade that the US finally became an inclusive, multiracial democracy. Not entirely, and not without massive resistance, but there were significant changes that happened in the 1960s that ensured that when Americans going forward thought of democracy, they would be thinking of voting rights and the popular vote, and when they thought of e pluribus unum, they would be thinking of people and not states. So to explain the turn to multiracial democracy, I want to start with a story from the state I live in, Tennessee. Charles Baker was a Republican mayor of a town called Millington, Tennessee. It's a little town near Memphis. And the district that he lived in, Shelby County, is the same county that Memphis is in. And during the first half of the 20th century, Shelby County grew like gangbusters. So much so that its population was 10 times larger than the rural districts in the state. And that meant that when Baker went as a citizen to vote, his vote had 1/10 the power of a voter in rural Tennessee. And so he sued, arguing that he was denied equal protection under the law because he was denied equal representation. And his lawsuit makes it all the way to the Supreme Court, where the case was heard in 1961. Over the next year, the justices wrestled and wrangled over the case, and they finally produced a decision after a year called Baker v. Carr. Now, Baker v. Carr is a very technical decision, and I'm not going to go into all of the ins and outs of it, but they basically decided that, okay, the Supreme Court can get involved in questions of how states draw their districts, that there is a fundamental question of equal protection that is at stake when a state determines what the districts look like. And that set the stage for a decision that was handed down 2 years later called Reynolds versus Sims, which settled the question that Charles Baker of Millington, Tennessee had initially raised. Now, in the case of Reynolds v. Sims, the state in question was Alabama. Just like Tennessee, it was a Jim Crow state, and it used a number of different counter-majoritarian measures to shore up the white vote and anti-Black politics. In the case of Alabama, what this looked like was that every county got a state senator, regardless of the population of that county. And as a result, in state government, you had malapportionment as big as 41-1. So in rural counties, one person's vote counted the same as 41 votes in a place like Birmingham. In an 8-1 decision, the court struck down Alabama's apportionment rules. And in doing so, Chief Justice Earl Warren cited a new democratic formulation: one person, one vote. He made his case this way, and this is kind of in the technical jargon of a Supreme Court decision, but hang with me here. Earl Warren, in his majority opinion, wrote, "The right to vote freely for the candidate of one's choice is the essence of a democratic society. And any restrictions on that right strike at the heart of representative government. And the right of suffrage can be denied by a debasement or dilution of the weight of a citizen's vote just as effectively as by wholly prohibiting the free exercise of the franchise." In other words, it was not enough that a person had the right to vote. Their vote had to be equal to other citizens' votes. That same year, the court also ruled that districts for the House of Representatives had to likewise be drawn to roughly equal in population. Now, Chief Justice Earl Warren would go on to say, after he retired, that Baker v. Carr and the cases that followed were, as he put it, the most vital decisions of his tenure on the court. That is a remarkable assessment. The Warren Court oversaw Brown v. Board, which allowed for school desegregation, Gideon v. Wainwright, which is your right to have a lawyer if you're arrested, Loving v. Virginia, which struck down bans on interracial marriage. But when Warren looked over his career, he looked at Baker v. Carr and he said, that one was the most vital decision. And it was the most vital decision because it made the country far more democratic and far more representative than it had ever been. And everything else flows from that. It was all because of that one principle: one person, one vote. Now, one person, one vote did not apply to every election. It did not turn the US Senate into a population-based body. It did not abolish the Electoral College. But it did hold up as the democratic gold standard the idea that each vote should carry the same weight. And in doing so, while it didn't remake the Senate or get rid of the Electoral College, it did diminish both. If one person, one vote was the gold standard, then there were some American institutions that did not measure up. There were other changes in the decade that followed that reflected how powerful the idea of popular democracy had become in the United States. As the court labored over Baker v. Carr and subsequent decisions, Black and white activists were setting up freedom schools and leading voter registration drives across the US South. They did so in the face of extraordinary violence. In the course of just 1 month, in early 1965, Jimmy Lee Jackson, James Reeb, and Viola Liosa were all killed in Selma, Alabama, as they organized nonviolent marches for voting rights. 5 days after Reverend Reeb's murder, President Lyndon Johnson addressed a joint session of Congress in what is really one of the most remarkable speeches ever given by a US president. It is absolutely worth taking the time to go back and listen to. It's a remarkably constructed address. But just for now, I want to share a few lines from this speech about democracy and the vote. Johnson, as he is addressing Congress, said, "Our fathers believed that if this noble view of the rights of man was to flourish, it must be rooted in democracy. The most basic right of all was the right to choose your own leaders. The history of this country in large measure is the history of expansion of that right to all of our people. Many of the issues of civil rights are very complex and most difficult. But about this, there can be and should be no argument. Every American citizen must have an equal right to vote." There is a difference between an equal right to vote and an equal vote. But the urgent moral case for voting rights, happening at the same time as the one person, one vote standard was set, helped fuse an idea of popular democracy as a core American quality, what it meant to be a democratic society. In August 1965, Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, and the US became, for the first time in its history, an inclusive, multiracial democracy. But the nation lacked the institutions to be the kind of democracy Americans were coming to expect. The Constitution had been written to dilute individual votes, but that idea that individual votes should be diluted was so fully associated with the old regime of Jim Crow and the even older regime of chattel slavery, and it was losing its luster. Especially because in the years after the Voting Rights Act, activists called for more democracy, more participatory democracy that went beyond the ballot box. They advocated for democracy wherever they could find it. In 1968, when Hubert Humphrey became the Democratic nominee without entering a single primary, activists pushed for primary reforms. They ultimately forced the Democrats and then the Republicans to abandon the smoke-filled convention halls and choose their delegates for the presidential nomination by popular vote. As the Vietnam War grew increasingly unpopular and youth activism spiked, protesters and reformers pressured Congress to amend the Voting Rights Act to lower the voting age to 18. When it became clear that you couldn't do that by legislation, the Supreme Court said you can change the voting age to 18 for federal elections, but not state and local elections. Then those same reformers got together and they passed a constitutional amendment to make sure that the voting age was lowered in state and local elections as well. Importantly, this great flourishing of democracy that was happening in the 1960s, even though we often associate it with liberals and with the Democratic Party, didn't generate the same kind of partisan conflict that you might expect. In fact, popular democracy seemed in the aftermath of these movements to favor the Republican Party. After the primary reforms took effect in 1972, opening up the Democratic Party to the selection of candidates by popular vote, the party took a historic walloping in the 1972 election. George McGovern, the Democratic presidential candidate that year, recalled the election this way: "I opened the doors of the Democratic Party and 20 million people walked out." So it hadn't redounded to the Democrats' favor, this new popular democracy, and 8 years later, when Ronald Reagan ran for president, he won in a massive popular landslide, and then he ran again in 1984, and he won in an even bigger landslide. His successor, George H.W. Bush, likewise sailed to an easy popular vote victory. But I think there's a change that's worth talking about because it sets up the current conflict, and it's a change that happened within the Republican Party in the 1990s. The party in that decade shifted to the right. It started to get out of line with popular policies, and it became increasingly reliant on an ever-shrinking white vote. It increasingly embraced unpopular policies that satisfied core constituencies, but didn't actually play that well among the broader politic. Party leaders leaned into polarization as a political tactic and turned to counter-majoritarian politics to win elections. Those counter-majoritarian politics ranged from racial and partisan gerrymandering to voter restriction to ideological litmus tests for the Supreme Court to the routine use of the filibuster. And of course, it has meant leaning into the Electoral College, which has twice in the past 25 years delivered the Republican Party the White House while the candidate lost the popular vote. And hey, those are the rules of the election. Whoever wins the Electoral College wins the election. If the Republican Party had to run for the popular vote, they would run different races, they would run different campaigns, they would run different candidates if the Electoral College didn't exist. But even though those are the rules of the game, for many Americans, the failure of the winner of the popular vote to win the election has created a crisis of legitimacy in the country. They know that the rules are the Electoral College, and they still feel like the person who won the most votes should win. So that has created a real problem of legitimacy in the country. And honestly, it's fair enough to state that the structure of our constitutional system is counter-majoritarian, it should be counter-majoritarian, that it's wrong for reformers to think otherwise. But the changes that culminated with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 created a new understanding of what the system should be, what e pluribus unum should mean. And that has led to a deep crisis. Because there are many Americans who see a conflict between popular democracy and vote dilution, the filibuster, gerrymandering, the lack of representation for Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico. Those frustrations have led to a range of new reforms and workarounds that see the Constitution as a problem to be solved rather than a sacred document to be followed. They see in the constitutional denial of D.C. statehood the disenfranchisement of hundreds of thousands of voters. They see the gutting of the Voting Rights Act by the Supreme Court as an attack on multiracial democracy. They see in gerrymandering an effort to engineer election outcomes against the popular will. They see in the filibuster an effort to block popular legislation. And they see in the Electoral College an effort to sidestep popular democracy. And I think these days we see all of those views as partisan, when they're really about a much bigger question of how government should function and whether we perceive it as legitimate. And by seeing it as a purely partisan conversation, we have cut off the debate about reform. And I think that only deepens the crisis of legitimacy. So I want to spend the last few minutes we have tonight talking about some of the avenues of reform, trying to put us up on a higher note, and how we might benefit from taking all of this out of a partisan lens and tackling the tough questions of the limits of democracy, of the Constitution. One of these limits is representation. And it is simply unconscionable to many Americans that citizens of the United States who have reached the age of 18 do not have congressional representation. In 1961, the 23rd Amendment gave the citizens of D.C. the right to vote in presidential elections. But per the Constitution, they have no voting representatives in the federal government, meaning that a territory with more people than Wyoming and Vermont lack representation. Gerrymandering, a tradition that dates back to the founding era, has taken on a particular focus in recent years as a tool to sidestep the purpose of one person, one vote. Racial and partisan gerrymanders used by both parties, have been a way to tilt states toward one party or the other, regardless of the state's composition. In the state where I live, Tennessee, I am represented by one of the most conservative members of Congress, despite living in a Democratic city. And the state government is 80-20 Republican, even though the state itself is 60-40 Republican. Representation and population have become uncoupled because of deep partisan gerrymandering. And this is not a problem that is going to be easily fixed, although there has been a movement against gerrymandering that has really picked up steam in the last 15 years. Recently, the Supreme Court, now with a 6-3 conservative majority, has sanctioned both partisan and racial gerrymandering, so drawing district lines to dilute voting power by party or race. There is a potential solution that a lot of people are considering: independent redistricting commissions. The House has twice passed bills to require such commissions. They've never been passed by the Senate. And lacking this national requirement, 11 states have adopted redistricting commissions. So instead of having a very partisan state house draw all of the lines for districts, you have an independent commission that does it. That's hard to put in place, because if you were elected to the majority in a state by a partisan gerrymander, just like those senators in 1913, you have to give up a little bit of power. You have to say, you know what, I might be redistricted, I might not be able to hold on to my seat, but I'm willing to do that in order to have a more fair system. And 11 states have adopted that. The Electoral College, too, has come in for a great deal of scrutiny in recent years, and it's even more challenging to modify. The Electoral College was created to mollify slave states, which would wield far more power under that system because of the 3/5 compromise. Many founders, including James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, wanted there to be a direct vote for president. But they lost the argument, and the bargain they made has remained a core feature of our elections. It has also been the most challenged part of our Constitution. Since ratification, more than 700 proposals have been introduced in Congress to reform or abolish the Electoral College. And in 1969, the country very nearly did. Birchby, who was a senator from my home state of Indiana, spent the 1960s combing through all of these proposed constitutional amendments and putting them forth for consideration. His efforts led to the 25th and 26th Amendments, as well as the near ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. He also pushed really hard after the 1968 election, which was whisper close. It was separated by like 0.5% between Hubert Humphrey and Richard Nixon. After that election, he said, we got to do away with the Electoral College. So he put forth an amendment to abolish the Electoral College, which successfully passed the House with 2/3 of the necessary vote and won the endorsement of President Richard Nixon. At least 30 states were lined up to do away with the Electoral College, to ratify the amendment if they received it. But in the Senate, where Southern Democrats still held sway, Bayh could not rally enough votes, and the amendment died. Now, according to a 2023 Pew Research Center survey, 65% of Americans want the Electoral College eliminated or altered so that the winner of the popular vote wins the presidency. And absent an amendment to the Constitution, which is kind of the only way you can do this, reformers have come up with creative ways to bypass the Electoral College altogether. The most compelling of these is the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which was first introduced in 2006. The idea here is that states who agree to this compact, if it looks like the popular vote and the Electoral College are going to go different ways, they're going to give all of their votes to whoever won the popular vote, regardless of the way their state voted. So it's their way of trying to shift it so that the system reflects the popular vote, regardless of how the Electoral College system works. It has a legitimacy problem. It's a problem if a state overturns the popular vote in the state in order to support the national popular vote. But as a workaround, it's something that could be a stopgap until it's possible for a constitutional amendment to be put in place. And all of these reforms and all of these changes and all of these challenges, they're all about the same thing: to bring electoral structures in line with democracy. They face two problems. The first is partisanship. In a two-party system, any change to the system is almost certain to favor one party or the other. Because of the policy choices made by the Republican Party in recent decades, changes that favor popular democracy almost always disadvantage the GOP. But I want to posit that more popular democracy could actually be a real boon for the Republican Party. At the moment, the party has built a coalition that requires a highly motivated base and ever more counter-majoritarian and undemocratic methods to hold onto power, relying on the Electoral College, gerrymandered districts, Supreme Court rulings, and mob violence to win elections has left the party wedged, embracing unpopular policies and procedural tricks in order to hold onto power. But if the party truly had to contend with the popular vote, if it had to run races that attracted moderates and even liberals into the coalition, then it would have to change its strategies and policies to appeal to a broader base. Republican presidential candidates would be able to choose from a much broader range of policies as they sought to win over voters in every state in the nation. Forced to compete for the popular vote, the Republican Party would have to change to become competitive, a move that could break the logjam in national politics. There are fears that certain parts of the country would be ignored in the switch to a popular vote. And you may not feel this from Michigan, but in presidential election years, most of the rest of the country is ignored during presidential elections. The Senate would still exist to ensure extra representation for small states. And most importantly, elections would have more legitimacy. More importantly than all of this, the nation would be treated not as a set of states, of which only 6 or 7 matter, but as a whole population. If the idea of e pluribus unum is to make a novel one out of a diverse many, a national popular vote does just that. But for any of these reforms to work, the Constitution can't just be sidestepped. It has to be changed. It has been more than 50 years since the Constitution was amended to be more democratic. I have to believe that that window of change has not been closed forever. And I have to believe that now is the time to imagine a different, more democratic way of structuring our government so that when the window of change opens again, we will be ready for it. In my daily life, I spend quite a lot of time thinking and writing about the political conflicts that define our country. I've listened to people argue against what seem like uncrossable chasms. I've seen people fight, and to my great sadness, I have seen people die. But I was talking to Megan yesterday about this idea of e pluribus unum and what it means to make the many one. It doesn't mean that we all walk in lockstep, that we all agree on the same policies or vote for the same parties. It does not mean, with apologies to President Obama, that there are no red states or blue states. What it means is that we, most of us anyway, share a common set of commitments to the rule of law, to inclusivity, to democracy. Most of us like to think that these are age-old values that have only just begun to fray. But they aren't. When it comes to this nation's experience as an inclusive, multiracial democracy, we are still taking baby steps. Uncertain, wobbly-legged, driven down by the gravity of polarization and hampered by our old constitutional order. But just because something is new doesn't mean it's impossible. And just because there are barriers doesn't mean that they are insurmountable. E pluribus unum has always been an aspiration, a goal to strive for. And on this Constitution Day, I invite all of us to remember the challenge the founders faced. They built a government, and it failed. So they built a new one. We have worked hard to build a democracy around an undemocratic constitution and worked hard to make that constitution more democratic. There is still more work ahead, but that is not a reason to quit or despair. It is a reason to dream, and then to do the hard work of building a more perfect union. Thanks.
At this time, as is customary, we'll switch to Q&A. Trina has the mic, I have a mic. If you'd raise your hand, we will do our best to work around and get to you all. Any questions tonight?
So is there any viable movement right now in Congress or anywhere else to get rid of the Electoral College?
Viable is a tricky term, but there is there have been a couple of bills recently introduced into the House. Not recently, but there have been bills introduced into the House that have passed through. And I think that it is part of that broader reimagining of what democracy might look like. Think about the H.R. 1, which is the complete revision of voting rights in the United States. I think that the movement to change the Electoral College is attached to that movement about voting rights and voting reform. But again, if you're going to do a constitutional amendment, it's going to be a slow build, right? You've got to get lots and lots of people on board. And at the moment, there's too much of a partisan split. But there are people who are both working on that and then also working on this national compact as sort of a workaround in the meantime.
Thank you for your talk. And one of the things that I found interesting is you cited that 11 different states have made a change regarding gerrymandering. That was one of our 2020, I think maybe 2022 initiatives. In the state of Michigan, we have a group called Voters Not Politicians that consistently and very appropriately puts things before the voters as ballot proposals and allows us to change our own state constitution rather than dealing with the politicians, which is enormously helpful. And we got gerrymandering dealt with, we got reproductive rights dealt with, and we also got term limits addressed. We saw that happen based also in Ohio, and I think Florida is doing the same. Mm-hmm. When you take it to the voters, it has an enormous impact to have an adjustment to your state constitution that allows the people to speak.
Yes, and I think first of all, thank you for that. And I think that it is true in many states where that is happening. It often cuts against our vision of those states. So to give President Obama a little credit, this idea that there are no red states, no blue states, states that are coded red are liberalizing their constitutions for things like reproductive rights, for things like marijuana, for things like Medicaid expansion that were denied them by their legislators. And that's that radical idea of initiatives and referenda, that idea that if your representatives aren't doing it, the people can take it into their own hands. Now, in a couple of states, their state Supreme Courts have gotten involved and stripped away the voters' rights. In some states, they have very high thresholds for any kind of change. But this has been, when democracy is denied at the federal level, you'll often see a real democratic flourishing at the state level. This is why states were often called laboratories of democracy, because that becomes the place where all this change can happen.
You brought up the fact that restricting voting might help the Republican Party in a certain way, but then also brought up the fact that, allowing these votes to come through might allow for some change to the Republican Party. Do you think the Democratic Party sees that and likes their chances better going against a unpopular, party? Because, people talk about the voting restrictions and how that can limit the Democrats, but I feel like it's not hounded enough, Like, I feel like that should be #1 talking point all the time if it's gonna help the Democrats win.
Yeah, it's really interesting and fascinating question, because one of the things that we've seen in response to voter restriction is that efforts to restrict the vote can be a catalyst for more voters to come out, because when somebody is attacking your right to vote, suddenly a lot more people are looking around and saying, well, it seems pretty important if they're trying to take it away. So it's had kind of the reverse effect. I think, one of the things that we've seen from the Democratic Party is a real push to try to expand the vote as much as possible. And that could actually be more short-sighted of them than long-term, right? That they might, right now it looks like if you were to expand the ability of people to vote, if you were to get more voters to turn out, that is going to work for the Democratic Party. That's what all of the political science says at the moment. But if the Republican Party did reform in order to try to win those voters, and they've done, there's been big policy changes in the Republican Party over the past few years that have been about trying to smoke out some additional votes by choosing more popular politics. This was the fight over the $2,000 checks right before the January 5th Senate elections, the runoffs in Georgia. It was like, give the people what they want and they'll vote for us. And then they didn't give the people what they want. They lost both elections. So I think that the Democratic Party is working very hard to get more people to vote. I'm hopeful that if you had like a really expansive popular vote in the United States, if it was easy to register, easy to vote, voter turnout was 80% like it was in the Gilded Age, I would hope that it would make the Republican Party more competitive, because we need a competitive two-party system. It's just the direction policy-wise that the party has gone has not been about winning the popular vote, and that's unfortunate, I think. It's a great question.
Thank you for, is that on? Thank you for a very helpful talk. I found it very fascinating. I find a little bit of a disconnect, though, between the idea that the Republican Party is riding a surge of popularism and the fact that democracy, as you've described it, really should be supportive of the popular vote. Why is the Republican Party seem to be resistant to all the good points you've made?
It's a great question. I think part of it is that so far it's worked. They're not getting Reagan-esque landslide victories, but they are winning the Electoral College more often than you would anticipate. I think that part of it, too, is that change is really hard. And the base of the party is really opposed to it. They're opposed to changing policies. I mean, we've seen this around the debates over reproductive rights, that the party is now split because there's a part of the party that really, really believes that abortion is murder and should be outlawed. And there's another part of the party that's like, but you can't win elections that way. And so they're at a kind of impasse. And I think that that has been kind of the wedge issue. So you'll remember after the 2012 election, there was something that was in the press called the Republican Autopsy, the Growth and Opportunity Project, that was all about like, how can we reform the image of the party to make it more popular? And they didn't do any of those things. They nominated Donald Trump instead. And Donald Trump won the 2016 election. And so suddenly they were like, okay, well, maybe we don't need to do all of those things about like saying nice things to Latino voters and like moving away from some of that sort of like white-centered politics. And so my real argument is, or my real thinking is, they would have to lose a lot in order to change, because right now it's too scary to give up their base. And they're still getting enough electoral gains through these counter-majoritarian institutions that they don't have to change yet.
Do you see a future where the U.S. either alters or replaces its current constitution like it did with the Articles of Confederation?
Not like the Articles of Confederation, because that was a whole, like, we're starting from scratch. I don't think Americans trust one another enough to start from scratch. Imagine, because you could imagine like a room full of people who think the same way you do writing a new constitution. That would be awesome. Like you could design it exactly like you wanted with all the values that you have sort of instituted in it. But then all the people you disagree with come in and they're trying to make it look like they want it to look. And suddenly you've got a problem, which is why some people are hesitant to try to like start pushing through amendments, because they're like, people we don't like are going to try to push through amendments as well. So I don't think it's going to be a start from scratch kind of thing. And I think another reason why is because we've actually done a pretty good job of jerry-rigging part of the Constitution, right? We've taken a Constitution that had nothing to say about the electorate and gotten it to say, no, actually, you have to include all of these people. So I think that there are ways to amend it without throwing it out altogether. It seems very, the crisis point we would have to hit to scrap it and start anew would have to be bigger than the crisis point we hit with the Civil War. And I don't think any of us want that kind of crisis. It's a great question, because I mean, imagine what the Constitution would look like if we started from scratch today. It would be very different.
Is the two-party system itself anti-democratic, and are there any initiatives out there to break that up?
I will say that the most asked question I get from my students is about third parties, and I think it's because for a lot of us it makes a lot of sense. Like we don't necessarily line up entirely with the two parties that we have, and a third party, many third parties might actually make it more enticing for people to vote. The problem is, the other thing that the Constitution is silent on is parties. It doesn't say anything about them. And parties emerge as soon as elections start happening. So the way that the system is structured itself is why we have two parties, the first past the post system, that the Electoral College is a winner-take-all system. If you amended the Constitution to change the Electoral College into a plurality, so whoever gets the most vote, even if you don't hit 270, that person wins the election, you might be able to break apart the two-party system and allow for a flourishing of more parties. So there's no way to sort of like legally break up the two-party system? To do it? That's a good question. I mean, yeah, I think more choices is more democratic. But I don't know that the two-party system is necessarily undemocratic. It's just a different way for democracy to look. I think it depends on how you define democracy, frankly. Like if democracy is more political choices, then a two-party system is really limiting. If a democracy is more a procedural question, then that's different. And a lot of people, I think, to further answer your question, the introduction of ranked choice voting and those kind of voting systems, I think are reforms that are allowing more political options to be heard without kind of a full revision of the two-party system. But that's a great question. I don't know where I fall on whether it's more democratic. It seems like people really want more than two parties, and we're not meeting that need.
Thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. This is personally the first presidential election that I'm eligible to vote in, which I'm super excited about. And one thing that I've noticed specifically from this historical election is that because we're having so many cross-party endorsements, specifically Republicans endorsing Kamala Harris, and most of them are on the grounds of democracy over party. So I'm very eager to see in future years, how do you think that the democracy over party outlook will affect future elections and even possibly future endorsements?
It's a great question because it's an interesting set of cross-party endorsements that are a little different from ones we have seen before. Like before we've seen like, oh, well, that person's too radical in this set of policies, or I'm really out of step where they are on foreign policy. But in this case, it's like the institutions themselves, right? The institutions are under threat, and Kamala Harris gave nothing to Liz Cheney in order to get Liz Cheney's endorsement. That came from like, we share a baseline agreement on democracy, and that's why we're going to join forces. The question of whether it's going to continue in future elections, I think depends on a couple of things. Do people perceive that the democratic system is under threat in future elections, or is that a novelty of elections with Donald Trump? I have some thoughts on that, but that's going to be one of the questions. And then another one of the questions is going to be, what does it get you? Does it hurt Kamala Harris that she's endorsed by Republicans, or does it help her? That's a hard thing to kind of A/B test. We don't really know. But does it drive away voters from the left who might vote for her? I don't think it does. But that is going to be part of the calculation. I was actually talking to Liz Cheney back in January when Joe Biden was still the president, and she was deliberating. What do I say? Do I come out and endorse him, or does that cost him too much? George W. Bush, is his silence because he doesn't want to come out and say anything? Probably. But it could be that he's like, I don't think this is going to help anyone if I come out and endorse Kamala Harris. Like, I'm not popular enough for that. So that kind of question of making the decision in order to shore up democracy, it depends on whether or not you think the endorsement will hurt or help. I do think that the cross-party endorsements, including Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr. endorsing Donald Trump, I think those are really interesting. And I think that they speak to the big shakeups that have happened among the parties and just in our politics and the sensibility of our politics more generally. But we'll see. I'm super curious whether, let's say it's the 2028 election and there are 0 Trumps on the ballot, whether we will be having the same conversation or whether people will be like, okay, we're fine, moving back to the political fights of the 1990s.
So it seems like the Supreme Court is the least responsive to democracy. And I can't think of what to say or do about that when we have justices who are originalists who want to take us back to 1776 and deal with democracy in the way that the 18th century people thought about it. So is there a way to make the Supreme Court more responsive to democracy?
Ooh, this is a great question, and I promise I'm not going to filibuster on this because I have lots of thoughts about the Supreme Court. But I mean, I think we have seen scholars of constitutional law and of the court come up with what they think are the best possible solutions for the Supreme Court. Again, the Supreme Court is meant to be an anti-democratic institution. It's meant to be a stop on popular legislation, and it's been for almost the entirety of its history, for more than 200 years of its history, it has been a conservative institution. And it has lost a lot of legitimacy in recent years because of the decisions that have been made. It's no longer seen as a kind of apolitical, above-it-all institution. Reforms for the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court arrogated unto itself in 1803 the power of judicial review. You could conceivably strip jurisdiction on a number of different issues from the Supreme Court. And in fact, that idea was floated by conservatives during the Warren Court because they didn't want the Warren Court ruling on issues like schools and abortion rights and those sorts of things, desegregation. They wanted to strip that sort of entire area from the Supreme Court. Term limits, which I think might have to happen through a constitutional amendment, is another way, just to sort of like up the circulation of the Supreme Court some. And then, of course, the idea of court packing or court expansion, if that makes you feel better. Which makes, I mean, there are lots of historical reasons that you can point to and say that this is a legitimate way to deal with the court. I don't trust that there are a lot of breaks on how politicians would approach that. So if you did pack the court to 13, then the next president would probably pack it to 20, and off to the races we go. Might not be the worst thing in the world, but so that there are these ways that legal scholars have come up with, and that surprisingly, Joe Biden, who is very much an institutionalist, at the beginning of his tenure as president, he was like, no way, no how, and now 3 to 4 years in, he's like, I endorse all of this. Let us change it. The Supreme Court has to be stopped. He's reached that frustration point that Franklin Roosevelt hit by like 1935, 36. I agree that it's a problem, and people are trying to find solutions, but they're very hard because of its place in the constitutional order.
Thank you, Dr. Hemmer, for this fascinating talk and a stimulating talk. So I'm curious about your argument that more democracy would moderate our politics. And although I agree with your point of view, say we did eliminate the Electoral College, would it make our politics more moderate or more demagogic, more big money oriented, more celebrity driven, more soundbitey? And I wondered if political scientists have sort of gamed out what it might look like if you actually got rid of the Electoral College.
I love this question because, of course, like I'm floating this as a potential, trying to find some upsides for getting rid of the Electoral College. But there are downsides as well. And one of them has to be, if you are waging a 50-state election, that is going to cost you a lot of money. Imagine having to compete in the media markets of New York City and Los Angeles. There would be so much more money flowing through politics. At the same time, with Citizens United, I think we're already drenched in outside and dark money, so it wouldn't necessarily change that particular equation. The same thing is true for celebrity and those kinds of things. More demagogic, again, Paul. Not demagogic enough for you already. Look, I do think that's possible. I don't think we know how politics would change if we rewrote the rules. I float this idea because I believe in the principle underlying it, that as long as you have strong protection against discriminatory laws, that more democracy is better than what we have now, which is less and less democracy. There will be knock-on effects. I don't know the political science literature on whether, which ones of those would emerge. And as a historian rather than a political scientist, I wouldn't trust it anyway. I think there would be. I think especially on the big money front. We would be even more inundated. You guys get so many campaign ads. Everyone would be getting as many campaign ads as you are getting in Michigan, and that could just drive us all crazy. No, what would happen? We're running a little experiment here in Michigan and Pennsylvania to see what happens when you give people 8 hours of campaign ads a day. But yeah, it's a great question.
Hi, again, thank you again so much for your presentation tonight. I'm more curious, you kind of talked about it a little bit in some of the previous questions, but I'm wondering, what does your mental picture or your picture you've drawn based on research, what does the post-Donald Trump America look like in your head?
So this is a fantastic question, the post-Donald Trump America. I wrote a book that looked at the origins of our contemporary politics, especially on the right, that suggests that we were kind of moving in this direction for the past 30 years or so. So Donald Trump isn't sui generis. He didn't just appear on the scene and radically alter our politics. That there were a lot of incentives built into our media environment and built into changes in the Republican Party more broadly that were already sort of moving in this direction. And then there's a fascinating observation from the past several cycles, which is the candidates who have tried to kind of do the Donald Trump thing have not pulled it off very well. That's not entirely true in every case, but it's a hard act to replicate. But I don't think that you're just going to see a reversion to mean. I don't think that you get, if Donald Trump loses in 2024 and 2028, another Mitt Romney. Like, that's not where the party base is. I don't think it's possible to predict where it goes. It could easily go to like Donald Trump Jr. and then your Trump era continues on. I think that a lot of people will be have been trying since 2016 to figure out what is the special sauce that has given him such control over the Republican Party, and can it be replicated? I don't know if it can be. I'm really, really curious to find out, but I don't think it's moving back to John McCain and Mitt Romney. I think it's going to continue in this particular like national conservative, popularist conservative direction.
I was interested in wondering what you think would happen to the participation in voting if we didn't have an electoral college, because as it is now, if you're a voter in Colorado and you want to vote for Trump, it would be like, why waste my time? Colorado's electoral votes are going for Harris. And conversely, if you're a Trump voter in New York, it's like that's a throw. So why vote at all? I'm staying home. And the stay-at-home vote, I think the most we've had recently in eligible voters voting is like 62%, something like that.
It's gotten pretty high. I mean, we have had, obviously like 150 million people turned out for the last election. So people are turning out. But if you felt your vote mattered, especially because, all of our local and state elections matter, but everyone focuses on the presidential election, and that's what people are hyped about. That's what they're donating to. That's what they care about. And if you opened up the popular vote and you made politicians if you made Democrats vie for votes in Indiana and in Oklahoma, and the Republicans to play in California and in Hawaii, they really like to campaign in Hawaii, I think that you would see more people turn out. And that would have a major effect, not just on presidential election, but on down ballot elections. Because when people turn out to vote for president, they end up voting for people lower on the ticket as well. So it's just another extra incentive to get people to turn out. And so that's I think a salutary effect of getting rid of the Electoral College.
We have time for one last question. I think Trina's got it in the back.
If I'm not mistaken, this coming election will mark 20 years since the Republicans have won the popular vote. In order for the party to remain relevant after the departure of Donald Trump, do you believe the time is now for Republicans to embrace Electoral College reform?
It's a great question. I think precisely because they haven't won the popular vote since 2004, and before that, since 1988, that it's going to be very hard for them to give up the Electoral College again until you get until it's no longer working, until you can no longer leverage enough votes to squeak out a victory in the Electoral College. Because Donald Trump has given up on winning the popular vote. He doesn't care about that, nor should he. And until this way of doing things stops working, it's going to be the way that Republicans continue to run elections. There was this moment, speaking of the 2004 election, there was this moment in 2004 where it looked possible that the way that John Kerry was going to win was by losing the popular vote and squeaking out a victory in Ohio. And if that had happened, if Republicans had won in 2000 through the Electoral College and Democrats had won in 2004 through the Electoral College, we might have gotten that reform that I'm calling for. But it didn't happen. And now we're kind of stuck with it until it stops working for one party. It's a great question. Thank you all.
What a fantastic talk tonight, and what a fantastic Q&A session. Kudos to all of you. This is one of the best that I think I've been a part of. So great job listening and thinking critically about these issues. And I'm already excited for the next one. A couple reminders before we head out this evening. Our next event that we'd love to see you at is a partner event we're doing with our colleagues at WGVU, the Padno Sorosik Center for Civil Discourse, and the Kaufman Interfaith Institute. And it's a listening event around a program we've been participating in called One Small Step. One Small Step is a program of StoryCorps, if you're familiar with StoryCorps, where we pair individuals with different political beliefs and ideologies. We pair them for a facilitated conversation. And the thing that is just wild, if you can believe it, is that people sit down and find that they have much more in common than they have in difference, if you will. There's actually still time. If you're interested in being a part of one of these conversations, you can apply online to do that. But we'll be having a listening event together on October 1st, and we would love to see you there. Also, we are partnering with those same colleagues to bring you something called the People's Guide. So if you go to a website called thepeoplesguide.org, we have put together a listing of helpful tips, tricks, things to keep in mind during this election season. We think of it as a wellness guide so that you all can navigate this season well and not feel too encumbered by what's going on. So if you need a break from the noise, or if you need a gentle reminder about where to find information, how to watch a debate, things of that nature, I encourage you to go to check out thepeoplesguide.org. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention our podcast on Spotify. So Off the Stage is where we get to talk with our speakers like Nikki and hear a little bit more about their background and their education experience and whatnot. And then also, Nikki is serving as our scholar in residence this year. So while we are allowing her to reside in Nashville so she can continue her work at Vanderbilt, she'll be back with us for President's Day, and we're also going to be doing a monthly podcast called, very aptly, E Pluribus Unum. So if you're looking for more insight in between now and President's Day, check in. We'll have a monthly podcast that we release with Nikki to get some insights about what's going on, what's happened in history, and how we can all E Pluribus Unum our way towards a brighter future. I'm making that a verb this year, so just be ready, okay? Last but not least, if we have any high school students here, I'd love to meet you afterwards and find out what school you're from, so find me out in the X Hall. And with that, I want to invite us all to stop, have a moment of conversation, enjoy some dessert outside those doors, and talk a little more deeply with each other about what we heard tonight and how we might all be participants in this great democratic experience that we find ourselves in. So with that, thanks again for coming. Have a great evening, and we'll see you at the next event.